Hi, everyone. It's good to see everybody here. Give everyone a second to get settled. Okay. Good evening and welcome back to the Laurier Milton Lecture Series with the Milton Public Library. It is so great to be able to gather this evening, and I hope that you're all comfortable with a beverage or a snack or both. Some small notes to share ahead of our lecture. We do have time carved out for questions because we know it's been a favorite part of these lectures. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom right of your screen, and you can say hello in the chat. I see it's already quite active. Hi, everyone. This lecture is being recorded and will be shared in a couple of days with all of you. My name is Carolyn, and I work for Wilfrid Laurier University. I am so proud of this partnership with the Milton Public Library. The Laurier Milton Lecture Series provides a wonderful opportunity to engage in public dialogue with citizens of Milton, and of course beyond, on a broad array of important topics. Presentations represent the current research and analysis from different faculties, departments, and programs at Laurier. Tonight's lecture is also part of the series of online offerings through Laurier during Black History Month. I'll share the link to these events and offerings in the chat if anyone is interested in learning more. Many of these events are open to the public, and I hope to see you there. Before we begin the program tonight, we'd like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share and protect our resources and not engage in conflict. The treaty was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory after losing much of the territory to the settlement of newcomers. Perhaps you're joining us from a different location tonight. If that's the case, I would encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the land where you reside. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters. This evening, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Barrington Walker. Barrington is the Associate Vice President, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and a professor in the Department of History at Laurier. Barrington holds a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. Before coming to Wilfrid Laurier University, he was an associate professor of history at Queen's University. A historian of modern Canada, Barrington's work focuses on the histories of Black peoples, race, immigration, and the law. Barrington's work seeks to illuminate the contours of Canadian modernity by exploring Canada's emergence as a racial state through its histories of white supremacy, slavery, colonization, immigration, segregation, and Jim Crowism. Much of his work considers how these practices were legitimized and in some cases contested by the rule of law and legal institutions. Tonight, this lecture will explore the Black experience in Canada by providing both an overarching view while being grounded in a few key moments or snapshots in the contested histories of Black people in Canada, from slavery to freedom. Thank you, Barrington, for your time, your energy, and your knowledge this evening.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's my pleasure to be here today. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy evenings to come and listen to me speak. And I would like to thank the organizers of this event, those both at Wilfrid Laurier University and the Milton Public Library, to share my thoughts with you this evening. And what I'm sharing with you today is research in the broadest sense of the word. This is not a research presentation in the usual sense of the term. I'm not currently writing a book on this particular topic, but the ideas that I will present here have found their way into my teaching and research over a number of years, the years before I joined Wilfrid Laurier University. I have taught courses in slavery and slavery's afterlives in Canada for many years. I've also written and edited a number of books that broach these matters. And most of these ideas, sparked by my teaching, have found their way into the public dissemination of my work in the form of keynote addresses, chapters for edited collections, edited books, and single authored books. The relationship between slavery and freedom, and between the past and the present, are issues that have preoccupied me for most of my professional career, starting in the early days of graduate school for me at the University of Toronto. In this talk, I'm going to outline the broad history of slavery and freedom in Canada. I am then going to pay some particular attention to slavery and the role of the law in Canada. I will then pivot to the era of freedom and the role of the law in shaping the era of freedom. And what I'm going to suggest in this talk today is that the times that we are living through right now, the loud and insistent cry for Black freedom bears the traces of slavery, an incomplete journey to full citizenship. In 1789 and 1808, two Negro bills were brought before the province's House of Assembly. Slave owners increasingly worried, and this is the Nova Scotian House of Assembly, slave owners were increasingly worried about the increasing social instability that was being wrought upon the province in the aftermath of the American Civil War, and they decided to act. The bill was, quote, an act for the regulation and relief of free people, or free Negroes rather, within the province of Nova Scotia. This document ostensibly then was about regulating the lives of free Black people, but in doing so it sought to cleverly enshrine slavery in Black letter law and in legal statute. The document was quite lengthy, but one of its key passages read, "Be it enacted by the Lieutenant Governor, Council, and Assembly, that from and after the publication hereof, all Negroes residing in this province, who are not slaves by birth or otherwise, shall not be convicted before any justices of the county in which such a Negro shall be found of not having a fixed place of abode or proper means of subsistence, or being an idle disorderly person, it shall and may be lawful for such justices to bind by indenture said Negro or Negresses, with or without their consent. To any person or persons whatsoever for any term not exceeding 7 years, provided that the master or mistress of said Negro shall not transport nor carry out of the province upon pain of incurring the penalty herein after mentioned." This is a fascinating document because it tells us about slavery, the property right in enslaved people that some people tried to protect in colonial Nova Scotia, and the experiences of Black people who lived on the razor's edge of freedom. And it's particularly this condition of living on the razor's edge of freedom that gives us a lens for thinking about the Black experience in Canada. So I want to turn now to an overview of slavery in Canada. Slavery was widely practiced in many parts of what we now know as Canada, right? The current day geographical area known as Canada. Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island are the areas that I particularly want to key in here. Jesuits also had a role of shaping slavery in New France. One of the first slaves recorded in the history of New France was a man by the name of Oliver Lejeune. The property was owned by a Jesuit minister by the name, or missionary by the name of Paul Lejeune. And you can tease out quite a bit about the history of slavery in New France from this one fact. And indeed, historians have done exactly that. What you can glean from this one fact about slavery in New France was that slavery, most fundamentally, was indeed in existence from the earliest years of New France's history. Although at this time it was on tenuous legal footing, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. It seems to have been sanctioned by the church. Members of the clergy seem to have been slave owners themselves. So we have a sense of just how important slavery was to the colony of New France. Prior to 1663, New France was administered by a company primarily concerned with developing a trade in furs, the Company of 100 Associates. Post 1663, New France changes to royal control. And the idea of employing slave labor in New France begins to be taken more seriously by colonial elites. Prior to this time, it was believed that slavery, in the context of what was essentially regarded as a fur trading frontier, it was generally believed in this context that slavery was undesirable, that it was unnecessary. As historian Robin Winks points out, it was believed in the main that slavery, that the fur trade rather, required neither skilled nor gang labor, which are the two types of labor that tend to characterize the slavery or slave labor. That's how historians divide them into skilled and gang labor. So in other words, according to Winks, a full-blown slave system had not been needed. Indigenous people, says Winks, enslaved many of their captives and occasionally sold penny, which was the name that French folks gave to, and Indigenous folks gave to enslaved Indigenous folks. Occasionally they were sold to the French to work in an agricultural capacity or in domestic labor. There was little demand for either slave or indentured labor in New France. And by that I mean primarily what you see during this time is that most of the slaves in New France during this era are indeed people of indigenous descent rather than people of African descent. Louis XIV gives royal assent to slavery after a call that was put in by the governor and intendant of New France. What the governor pointed to was the fact that over time, there was an increasing demand for labor in the colony, both domestic and agricultural. The population of French Canada was approximately 9,000, and colonial elites encouraged residents to engage in pursuits of farming, mining, and fishing. And there are a couple of theories for why some in New France pushed to see slavery implemented there. And one of the reasons that historians have given is based on status and the perceived status that was attached to those who owned enslaved persons, right? They were seen as luxury objects. And that's a terrible term, but that was a term that was used. The other revolves around revolves around economic issues or economic concerns. First, it is often argued that the colonial elite desired the status that was attached to owning slaves. The second line of argument claims that colonists lobbied for slavery because they believed themselves to have been economically hindered by the absence of the institution, and that slavery was an advantage that their rivals in New England had over them. In 1689, King Louis XIV issues the following statement. His Majesty finds it good, 1689, King Louis XIV issued the following statement. His Majesty finds it good that residents of Canada have Negroes come here to labor, but it is necessary to note that it is possible that these Negroes coming from such a different climate could perish in Canada and render the project a failure. Despite Louis XIV's reservations about the suitability or lack thereof of the Canadian climate for Black enslaved people, and arguments that the Canadian climate is unsuitable for Black people is ubiquitous in Canadian history. And these kinds of ideas are in circulation right up until the liberalization of immigration policies in the early 1960s. So these ideas have a long trajectory. Between the legalization of slavery in New France in 1689 and the British conquest of the colony, slavery grew albeit sporadically, in Canada. So you see an increase in slavery. You see an increase in the enslavement of African descended people. In 1716, the intendant of New France renews the call for more enslaved people of African descent, therefore echoing the sentiments of many colonists. He argues that Black people can be used in a variety of capacities like fishing, agricultural labor, logging, shipbuilding, and mining. So, having laid that out, what was the condition of the slave in New France? Drawing on the work of celebrated historian Marcel Trudel, Winks, again, Robin Winks, provides us with an interesting sketch of the lives of slaves in 18th century New France. Roughly 3,604 slaves were in existence in the colony by 1759, and 1,132 of these were Black. Less than 1/3, most are Pani or belonged to other indigenous groups, as I mentioned before about the predominance of indigenous slavery. The French, according to Trudel, preferred the Pani, but after the conquest, as we shall see, the British conquest, the numbers of Black slaves rises rather dramatically. So what kinds of work did slaves do? Despite the desires of the intendant, the fact is that few slaves worked in fields or mines. Most were domestic servants, and most of these, in turn, were owned by wealthy merchants, and most lived in towns or cities. So we have a sense that most slaves were involved in domestic labor rather than rougher pursuits like agricultural labor or mining that characterized slavery in other parts of the Americas. So this leads us to one of the questions that is often asked about the institution of slavery in Canada. And this is the question of the harshness of slavery. At least it was asked by this question, sort of insistently asked by earlier generations of historians. This kind of question has kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit now. Now, what I mean is this. Many have argued, and certainly historians in Robin Winks's generation, that the system of slavery in New France was less harsh than slavery in other places. Winks pointed to a number of factors to support his argument why slavery in New France was less harsh than in other places in the Atlantic world. He pointed to a combination of the ameliorating effects of Catholicism and the effects of a legal code called the Code Noir. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Code Noir in the following section. I'm going to talk here now a little bit about the transition to British rule, which is a very important moment in thinking through the history of slavery in Canada and what it meant for the enslaved people in Canada. And what was the condition of the slave under British rule post 1760? And again, this brings us back to questions around the harshness or the relative harshness of the institution. Canada did not have the sort of plantation complex or plantation context that characterized slavery in other parts of the Americas. Thus, most slaves in Canada were employed by the merchant class, similar to what happened in New France. And these slaves served in a variety of capacities, including domestic labor, whilst others worked on farms. The relatively low numbers of slaves, again, compared to other parts of the Americas, and the lack of the plantation complex led many scholars to argue, similar to arguments that were made about the institution in New France, that slavery was relatively benign. So that slavery in Canada is relatively benign. But we do know, on the contrary, from the work of scholars such as Charmaine Nelson, that slavery under British rule could be extremely harsh. Slaves were surveilled in a context where their Blackness, quote unquote, made them highly visible. They also found themselves sold on auction blocks and bequeathed as property in wills and estates. And I will expound upon this in the next section. We also have stories in the historical record about acts of spectacular cruelty towards enslaved people in Canada. So I'm sorry, some of you are mentioning in the chat that my picture is a little bit fuzzy. I hope that sorts, or I hope it has sorted itself out. So I'm going to say again a little more about slavery as a legal institution, right? A lot of this talk is going to center around questions of law in the time that we have left. Slavery in Canada, it was supported and recognized by a number of laws, statute law, and tacitly, and especially under British rule. So statute law in the context of New France, as I just talked about, and tacitly, especially under British rule, right? And by this I mean through the recognition of the right of property to own human beings. However, as we will see, the right to slavery as a property right was often contested through the law. In New France, so stepping back into the period before the conquest again, after a few years where the legality of slavery was not entirely clear, slavery is given loyal assent by King Louis XIV. Slavery in New France gains its legal footing between the years of 1689 and 1907. Another way in which slavery is legally recognized is through the customary application of the Code Noir. The Code Noir was devised as a legal code to regulate slavery in France's Caribbean possessions. This document, which is quite famous for amongst people who study this period, outlined the rights and responsibilities of the slave and the slave holder. The Code Noir decreed that all slaves were to be baptized and instructed in the Catholic religion. Slaves and, Sundays and saints' days were to be observed, and no slave could be made to work or sold on these days. The Code Noir also mandated that slaves could not fill any office or agency, that they cannot sue, or they could not sue or be sued. And also that, and you'll see this pattern across the Atlantic world, that slaves were not allowed to give evidence in court, that their evidence would only be used to enable a judge to understand the evidence presented by others. So a slave's testimony then could not be used to support presumption, conjecture, or proof. However, under the Code Noir, slaves could be criminally prosecuted just like free men. So for example, and this example is raised in the Code Noir, or was raised in the Code Noir, a slave who struck his master's wife, or children in the face, or with the effusion of blood, was to be punished by death under the tenets of the Code Noir. I'm going to turn now and talk a little bit about the legality of slavery under British rule. So throughout the history of slavery in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, there's some ambiguity. So we're moving into the period post-conquest now regarding its legality. De facto slavery exists after British conquest, but in reality, one could argue that de jure slavery recognized by black letter law, did not. As I said before, slave property was certainly protected in the statutes of the Treaty of Paris and the Imperial Act that followed. But there was no positive law of slavery in Upper Canada or Lower Canada. So why was this? After the British took over, Lower Canada in 1763, the British allowed the French to keep their slaves. Right, so this is part of the allowance that the British make for French slave owners, is that they don't disrupt the institution of slavery. They allow former slave owners to continue on owning slaves. In 1774, the Quebec Act is passed, and in a bid to retain the loyalty of the French, British civil law is wiped and French civil law is reimposed. And that was law that had legally sanctioned slavery under Louis XIV in 1689. In 1792, the British reintroduced British civil law, wiping out slavery's foundation in French civil law. In addition to this confusion going back and forth between different civil law regimes, there was a legal ruling in Britain called the Somerset case in 1792. During the Somerset case, it was ruled that that slavery was illegal in Britain, and that the air of England was, quote unquote, too pure for slavery. Many thought in British North America that as British citizens, slavery must be illegal there too, but that was erroneous. Many believed that the introduction of slavery into the colony meant that slavery was illegal, but again, that was erroneous. And in the Maritimes, slavery is also, for the most part, on a rather tenuous legal foundation. In Nova Scotia, like Upper Canada and Lower Canada, de facto slavery exists, whereas de jure slavery, or slavery in law, does not. So for most of Canadian slavery then, there's some ambiguity in that slavery was never expressly permitted nor forbidden. So it's this kind of legal no man's land over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries that judges grapple with the legality of the institution, often reaching at somewhat of an impasse. In New Brunswick, rather, the institution of slavery is closely tied to slavery in Nova Scotia, because New Brunswick was a part of Nova Scotia until 1784. The legality of slavery in both areas was tenuous, particularly so in Nova Scotia. There was no law ever passed that specifically legalizes the institution, and I remind you to remember the statute that I read off the top of the lecture. However, settlers with slaves were routinely allowed to enter into the province with their slaves. 2 bills were introduced regarding slavery, as well as one for the physical protection of older slaves in 1801, but opposition in the House of Assembly of Nova Scotia kept the bills from being passed. Thus, slavery was never legal nor illegal in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. It just existed. In Prince Edward Island, the institution of slavery was the only, PEI was the only province where slavery had a sound legal footing. In 1781, the legislature passes an act legally recognizing the institution. And in PEI, the act had 2 components. The first indicated that all Black servants residing, and the Brits often use the term servant instead of slaves. It's one of those, and call it maybe a quirk of British culture, but a more polite way of talking about slavery, which subsequently has made it historically difficult for historians to pin down the exact number of slaves in British North America for precisely this reason. So in 1781, the legislature passes an act legally recognizing slavery, and the act had 2 components. The first indicated that all Black servants residing on the island, as well as those brought in as slaves, could not be freed by baptism nor conversion to Christianity. The second indicated that all children born to enslaved women would be considered the property of the woman's owner. So I'm going to turn now from talking about the ways in which the law in Canada supported slavery. Remember, we talked about the ways in which it supported slavery, both overtly and tacitly. And I want to talk about how the law also worked as a tool of resistance to slavery. So I want to say a few words about the challenges that were posed to slavery in British North America. And these challenges portended the eradication of slavery across the British Empire. In 1793, in Upper Canada, Lord John Graves Simcoe, the Lieutenant Governor, who was known for agitating against slavery in England, continues this work when he comes to Upper Canada. And there's some debate about the extent to which John Graves Simcoe was an anti-slavery champion. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you wish. So what is clear, or what has been argued in the literature, is that Simcoe, and you all know Simcoe because of Simcoe Day, we get that holiday in the province of Ontario, was moved by the spectacle of the sale of a slave named Chloe Cooley. So it's often argued that him witnessing this, particularly the violent transfer of Chloe Cooley in a boat, she was roughly handled by her owner, a man named Adam Vrooman in Queenston, Upper Canada, who transported her for sale into upstate New York. So this spurs Simcoe to action. So when Simcoe decides to go to the Assembly in Upper Canada to press for restrictions on the practice of slavery, it's met with resistance on the part of the slaveholders in the province. In the end, Simcoe was able to carry the day, likely because what he proposes is a compromise measure of sorts. He pushes for sweeping legislation that would wipe slavery out, but instead he'd have to settle for a compromise that placates slave owners. And the act that he comes up with, the act that he can get slave owners and the legislator to agree with, asks for basic tenets. The first is that slaves entering the colony after the passage of the act would be free. None of the blacks enslaved at the time were freed by this legislation, and that's why there's some controversy around Simcoe's legacy as an anti-slavery champion. Any persons born into slavery after the statute was passed would be freed by the age of 25. And if any of the same persons gave birth before reaching the 25th birthday, their children were to be considered free at birth. So what the 1793 statute did was ensure that slavery would soon become extinct. Though to be sure, there is some disagreement amongst historians regarding how progressive this measure was, because in actuality, it doesn't free a single slave when the bill is passed. In Lower Canada, there's a genuine decline in slavery between the years of 1797 and 1799. And provincial judges tend to rule in favor of enslaved Black people, effectively reducing the power of slave owners. So what you find is during this era, Black people are pushing the boundaries of slavery as they begin to realize, or pushing against the boundaries of slavery, as they begin to realize that the law is increasingly tilting in their favor. And what I mean is this. Some of the province's judges declare that the burden of proof regarding ownership of a slave falls upon the owner. And in this instance, in this particular circumstance, this is far different than what you find in the United States, where the burden of freedom is placed on enslaved peoples, right, to the point where enslaved peoples have to carry around papers, manumission papers and this sort of thing to prove that they're free. Ownership, judges ruled, had to be confirmed upon presentation of a written title. And this burden, again, was placed on slave owners. In Lower Canada, there was a genuine decline in slavery between the years of 1797 and 1799. Again, provincial judges tend to rule in favor of enslaved Black people, again, gradually reducing the power of slave owners. In Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, justices generally avoided direct rulings on the legality of slavery. They knew that slavery was legally sanctioned as property or as a property right, but they did not want to enforce this. They tended to ask parties to work out private agreements akin to indenture. If that failed, so in instances where the status of a Black person, whether this person was slave or free, it often went to juries who often found in favor of slaves, therefore legally smothering the institution. Slaves and their advocates also used writs of habeas corpus to fight for their freedom. And this measure in the Canadian context proved to be a highly effective means of securing freedom. What this does, so this turn to habeas corpus, and I can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A. This compels slave owners to turn to trover, right, which is a legal remedy. That is the action to recover lost wages or the value accrued from such wages in a bid to try and hang on to the institution of slavery. So you have a lot of slave owners then trying to recover what they call lost wages or the lost value in their slaves using actions of trover. And slave owners generally find this sort of remedy to be ineffective. In any case, by 1834, what happens is that slavery is eradicated, 1833, 1834 rather. Slavery is eradicated across the British Empire. But in actuality, slavery was already in decline in British North America by then, and the Maritimes by then. And it's because of all of this history that I just laid out for you. So 1833, 1834, we have the era of post-slavery in Canada, and the era that most people recognize as being quintessentially Canadian, right? So this idea that Canada is a frontier of slavery for enslaved peoples. There's one thing that I would like you to take away from this lecture, and it's a point that many of my colleagues have made over several years. You know, we're taught the mythology, and I'm calling it mythology around the Underground Railroad. That's taught in our schools. That's a part of what we learn from a very young age in Canada. The truth of the matter is the Underground Railroad doesn't begin to take form. It doesn't exist. It can't exist until this long history of enslavement ends in the Canadian context. So 1833, 1834 brought with it a frontier of legal freedom for Black people in Canada. And this is not to say that free Black communities did not exist in Canada before this time. They did. I don't have time to go into this in a great deal of detail here because I have decided to spend the bulk of my lecture talking about slavery. But many of the Loyalists, for example, who came to Canada in the aftermath of the American Revolution were free Black people. And they were granted freedom as a result of their loyalty to the British Crown. Similar kind of story to Indigenous Loyalists, except for the enslavement part. And some had even taken up arms for the British during this time. These Black Loyalists later had the limits of their loyalty tested. And I should say that I'm going back in time now, before 1833, 1834, back into the late 1700s, 1780s, on the aftermath of the American Revolution. So I'm sorry for jumping back and forth chronologically. These Black Loyalists had their loyalty tested when they realized that they were not to be granted the same allotments of land as their white counterparts, either in terms of the size of land allotments or the quality of land allotments. Disillusioned, many decided to leave Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone, West Africa, where they sought to begin their lives anew. Similar challenges faced Black people who migrated to Nova Scotia in the aftermath of the War of 1812, the so-called Black refugees. What they find when they arrived in Nova Scotia are pervasive forms of discrimination and attempts similar to that of their predecessors, so the Black Loyalists. They find attempts to place them and keep them in a status of subordination. Rather than the lives of independent yeoman farmers that they sought, the goal on the part of a lot of white Canadians was to place them, or I should say more specifically, white Loyalists, was to place them in the position of sharecroppers, rentiers, and laborers. And this was a position that was conversant with the history of slavery. So what you see is this attempt to try and push free Black communities down into the same status that they had during slavery. So there's this really persistent attempt to associate Blackness and slavery, right? So this was the quote unquote proper place that Blackness was to be afforded in Canada. Over the course of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, this pattern of Black struggle and survival and triumph in the place of racism and discrimination and white supremacy and pervasive patterns of what I've called in some of the previous work that I've done, Jim Crow and others have called. These examples abound, and I'll share some of these examples with you now, and I'm happy to talk about some of these in the Q&A as well. So the Underground Railroad era, the era of Black history in Canada, with which most people on this call will be most familiar because of its place, again, as I said, in Canadian myth-making and national pride, was characterized by the same dynamic, this tension between slavery and freedom, and resilience as well in the patterns of systemic discrimination. Black people, many of whom fled slavery in the United States, came to find when they arrived in Canada that they enjoyed legal freedom. And I think that's a very important part of the legacy of the Underground Railroad era. So the late 19th century to the mid 19th century. So they enjoyed legal freedom. They were legally freed, and many came to Canada to enjoy those freedoms. It's also true that many Black people who came to Canada during this era were already freed, and they actually came to Canada in order to enjoy freedom from discrimination. And those who came to Canada to escape discrimination would find themselves rather bitterly disappointed. What they found was a landscape where they encountered segregation in the schools, they encountered segregation in houses of worship and residential patterns. They were often also subject to forms of regular indignities, such as being called the N-word to their faces in their day-to-day business going about cities like Chatham, Windsor, etc. In the early 20th century, Canada nearly passed a law, so jumping ahead to the early 20th century, banning Black migration into Canada out of fears of growing Black migration from the US South. The act, and I should say that during this time, Canada was undergoing a rather aggressive advertising campaign to try and settle the Canadian West. They had these big posters that they'd advertise in the United States with words emblazoned Canada's last, or the last best West. This ad campaign was directed at white Americans. The Canadian government was quite dismayed to learn that Black Americans were also looking at these ads as well and getting ideas about migrating to Canada. What happened is that the Canadian government embarked on a rather ambitious disinformation campaign. They hired a Black doctor to go to the United States and spread disinformation about how Black people would perish if they crossed the border and came into Canada. They also conducted rather rigorous medical examinations at the border to try to weed people out. But nonetheless, about 1,000 Black settlers managed to make an indelible mark on the prairies and form resilient communities in the Canadian West. And they, for example, the communities of the Amber Valley, and they remain some of the most historically significant Black communities in Canada. In the mid-20th century, in the post-war era, a group of Black activists demanded that the Canadian government get rid of immigration restrictions against Black immigrants. So this happened around the 1950s, right? So immigration restrictions that had been in place right up until the 1950s and into the 1960s, making it very difficult for Black immigrants to come to Canada. And this activism, the success of this activism is a large part of the reason why the immigration landscape in Canada looks quite different after 1967. And it's also when my family was allowed to come to Canada as well. That's when you see Black immigration from places like the Caribbean beginning to swell in Canada as a result of the work of these committed activists. So in conclusion, what I have done here, I hope, is to give you some sense of the broad contours of slavery and freedom in Canada, what it looked like, a little bit about the world of the slave person and the slaveholder, and the various laws, including the law of property, that help to support the system. So there has been a lot of detail in this lecture, perhaps a little too much, but this is what I would like you to hopefully remember after having listened to me speak to you now for some 45 minutes. So first, slavery was an integral part of life in New France and British North America. Second, the law was integral in maintaining the system of slavery, though its recognition of the slaveholder's right to alienate property and bequeath said property to heirs. Third, the law does have a role in chipping away at the institution. Slowly, the legal foundation of the institution was eroded through a number of means that we have discussed. The burden for proving that one was a slave fell on the putative master, not the slave. And this is something that shapes slavery in this part of the world in rather profound ways. Fourth, the history of slavery, law, and the colonial state frames the history of Black freedom struggles to follow. The moment that we are living through, punctuated by insistent calls for the sanctity of Black life, the insistence that Black lives matter can be traced back to slavery in Canada and its afterlives. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. At this point, I have one question. If anyone else has a question, please use the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. My name is Maria Patrico, and I'm the manager of branches at the Milton Public Library, and I'm happy to facilitate the question and answer session now. So this question is, I've heard of a bill being proposed in the US where descendants of slaves would be paid a sum of money. What are your thoughts of this for the US and for other parts of the world?
The viewers want to start off with a non-controversial, easy question. So I believe that, are you able to speak to the speakers or just read the questions? Is there an opportunity for dialogue with the folks who are posing questions? No.
They can type if they would like to, and I'll read that to you. And this particular person is named Cheryl. Okay.
Thanks for your question, Cheryl. If I've misinterpreted your question, just please type something in the box. So I think what you're getting at is the whole idea of reparations, and the idea of reparations is that, and I'll be quick because we don't have much time. That one of the unfortunate things about slavery is that people who were descendant of slaves, and I count myself amongst that number, you could work for. Enslaved peoples aren't able to benefit from the wealth that they generate. So they both represent wealth for the people who own them, and they create wealth as well, right? So this is what has now resulted in a very persistent wealth gap in the American context. We have less data in the Canadian context. So, programs like affirmative action, for example, have tried to address this. And affirmative action, of course, is very controversial. But affirmative action, I'm going to suggest to you, is actually quite a modest measure for getting at intergenerational disparities in wealth, because it can't make up for 7 or 8 generations of lost wealth, right? So even data from upper middle class Black people, what you find, for example, is that while the salaries, and I don't want to speak for every Black person, but the data is the data. Even when salaries are the same, the wealth position is quite different because of intergenerational transfers of wealth. And we're about to embark upon one of the largest, some of you probably have already benefited from this, intergenerational transfers of wealth ever. The boomers are about to get a whack of dough from parents and things that have passed on. So I'll answer the question. So I think in that context, part of solving that pernicious question of race and the question of African Americans that have preoccupied African Americans since the beginning of slavery is addressing this wealth gap. And I do believe that reparations is an important part of addressing that wealth gap. I do believe that there's a moral imperative for the government of the United States to address that, right? I do believe that is owed people of African descent because of 400 years of slavery. And yes, I would make similar arguments about imperial governments that enslaved people as well. So.
Someone's made a comment here. Wasn't affirmative action created initially to give equal payment and opportunity for white women?
Carlos, I'm gonna have to go back and check that. My understanding is that term is originally, and I could be wrong about this, but everybody's got Google now, but that by LBJ was the first person who wanted to use that specifically as a measure to address those inequalities or those inequities. And that was a big part of his legacy, ironically, his background. Somehow this has turned to a lecture on African-American history, so I'm sorry about that. Or a comment on African-American history. But it is true, so I'd have to fact check that, Carlos. And is that hi, Carlos? Carlos is, anyway, I think that is the Carlos Morgan. I think it's certainly true, Carlos, that that white women have been the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action, right? That has been one of the legacies of affirmative action. So I think that's certainly true.
Carlos actually also asked, what do you think of Canada offering an official apology to Black people for slavery?
Yes, it is, Carlos. You know, I've gone on record. I gave an interview for the Globe and Mail, I guess to much pushback in the comment section about this, Carlos, and I did argue that although in some ways the case is a little bit harder to make in the Canadian context because characterizes the Black Canadian story are different waves of migration to Canada. We don't have the same unbroken story that you see in the American context. But I think if you frame the question in a British imperial context, I think there's a strong argument to be made for reparations, you know, to Black people in the Canadian context who come from various points of entry, many of us have ancestors that were enslaved in the British imperial context, a British imperial context that was integral to the development of Canada. So when one starts to look at the imperial ties, you know, the links in commodities and goods and money and capital flows between modern day Canada and in and through the British Empire, you know, I think a case for it becomes pretty clear. So I would argue, yes, I know it's a controversial, I know it's controversial for many people, but I am a firm believer in reparations. I don't think I'm likely to see it in my lifetime.
So Cheryl had a follow-up question to that, and to say, what do you say to those who oppose this reparation based on their argument that you can't control how they spend the money? Oh no, I hope we didn't lose him. Are you still there? Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Okay, good. Oh, you can't see me?
No.
Oh no.
But we can hear you, so that's good. Hopefully you return.
Okay, well, I don't know what happened. I'll keep
here,
going.
let me try this here.
So I think, Cheryl, if everybody can still hear me, I think that question respectfully kind of strikes at the heart of, okay, you can see me now, good. I think it kind of strikes at the heart of, and I say this respectfully, Cheryl, so maybe some of the attitudes about, you know, dictate, you know, what African descent do with the money. So I think that's I think that's not where I think I'd like to see that conversation go. I will say, though, that there are other folks who believe that rather than giving people individual payouts, that what you'd want to see are, you know, programs or supports or that sort of thing. So I think it's a complex issue. I fall on the side of giving people individual disbursements, given the history and given how these inequities in wealth came to be. I'm in favor of giving people disbursements and trusting people to do as they will with that money. But I know that not everybody feels that way, and I think there are some activist folks out in Nova Scotia who would argue differently. So there's even a debate within the Black community around that as well.
Zoe has asked, were there any payouts similar to Canadian slave owners, similar to what Britain gave to slave owners? Apparently the equivalent of 16.5 billion today for the loss of property, in quotations, which were slaves.
Okay, so across so you do see these similar payments given to slave owners. The French Empire, certainly you see this in the Caribbean as well. I don't know about any similar sorts of payments given to Canada. I've never come across to slave owners in Canada. I've never come across anything like that.
And Rena asked a similar question, but she's asking, how do we go about staking our claim? So in the British Empire, slave owners were
How do we go about?
compensated. Their descendants have benefited from reparations, but Black people who are the descendants of slaves in the British Empire should receive reparations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of the answer to this is that we need some intentionality about researching those ties that Canadians have to slavery, that Canadian institutions have to slavery. And I think a good place to start might be there's work that's being done in the Caribbean that's actually quite impressive. I know that at the University of West Indies, there's an institute that's dedicated to this particular question, so putting a dollar figure on how slavery in Jamaica benefited the British Empire. So I think, as an academic, I'm a big believer in doing that work, right? Doing that solid historical research, tracing those histories and making a claim based on evidence, right? Much the same way that indigenous folks do with land claims, right? These are claims that are based on rigor and on evidence, and I think that's the way to go. I hope that answers the question.
Wanda has asked, have you visited the Black Loyalist Heritage Center in Nova Scotia? And do you have any comment on how it represents and upholds history?
No, I have not visited the Black Loyalist Center in Nova Scotia, so I can't comment specifically on how they represent. I think I've read about it. I've read about that center. I read about an author who did a lot of work in that center. What I will say really briefly is I think that the work of community historians, the work of people who are the direct descendants of those folks is just tremendously important work. And the work of university-based historians like me, we're tremendously indebted to people doing that work. I think they do an excellent job in representing that history and disseminating it to a broader public. So I think, having not been there, I think I can confidently say that I'm sure the work that they're doing is excellent.
Sorry, I have my daughter running around in the other room, and I don't want to be interrupting. There was a question here, and it seems to have just disappeared. So I don't see the person's name here, but what are some good sources of information, for example, books or videos to learn more about the topic? And if you have any you'd like to share with myself or Carolyn, we can add that to the thank you email we send to participants.
Well, I won't self-promote. So I think
you should
take a look at. You're welcome. Take a look at Amani Whitfield's work. So he's written an important work on slavery in the Maritime provinces that I think is quite good. And I'm sorry, the title escapes me right now, and I'm going to cheat and just look it up. I would look also at Afua Cooper's work. She's written a fine book called Angelique, which is one of the stories I would have told you about if I had more time. So this is a story of a Black woman who burned down old Montreal, right? It's a love story. It's a story about the harshness of slavery in New France. So I would recommend Afua Cooper's work as well. So Amani's written a book called Black Slavery in the Maritimes, a history. He's also written a book called North to Bondage, which is about slavery during the Loyalist era. I would look at Robin Winks's work, The Blacks in Canada. I think I would start there, specifically on the slavery question. Robin Winks's work will take you throughout the entire history of Blacks in Canada, but there are a lot of good works on African Canadian history that I could share in an email with you. There's a lot there.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I had missed a
Scott's
question, and
question?
someone had
Hi, Nancy.
Thank you
Here.
so
Yeah, so
much
north of
for
bondage.
catching that. I accidentally missed that one. So Scott has asked, Simcoe aside, is there an anti-slavery activist who we may not know of, who we should celebrate more in Canadian history?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot the way in which a lot of the literature is moving is celebrating Black anti-slavery activists, and a lot of the ways in which the work is sort of pivoted away from figures like Simcoe to talk more about some of these folks. So I would say a figure like Marianne Shatt, example, would be somebody that you might look into. The first Black woman to own, the first woman to own a newspaper in Canada, who was quite an ardent anti-slavery activist during that era. I think even well, he's not really unknown, but I think a figure like Josiah Henson would be somebody to look at. So he was the fellow upon whom Uncle Tom's Cabin was roughly based. But I mean, most of what Uncle Tom's Cabin is a bit of a fabrication. But he was a pivotal figure in Canada West. And who am I thinking? Samuel Ringgold Ward, I think, was an important figure during this era as well. So those are the sorts of folks I think that are not as well known as they should be, who are at the forefront of agitating against slavery in Canada. So I would, and I didn't talk about this much because I focus on the law and legal institutions, but I would encourage the group to look at Black anti-slavery activists as well, because they tend to be written as passive recipients of the largesse of whites on both sides of the border, rather than people who actively fought to dismantle the system of slavery.
And that was our final question. So thank you so much on behalf of Wilfrid Laurier University, the town of Milton, and the Milton Public Library. Thank you, Dr. Walker, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening. Thank you also to all of the attendees for joining us. The popular question, yes, a copy of tonight's lecture will be shared on the Milton Public Library website in the next few days as well. We have it posted on YouTube as well, and if you missed any previous lectures as well. Our next Laurier lecture will be on March 10th, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely night.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.